Andy Dalton, consensus rankings, outside the ESPN top 25 for quarterbacks, which means that unless you're playing in the 2-quarterback league, you are not considering drafting him. I will just mention this. From week 3 on last year, because for those who don't remember the first 2 weeks in Cincinnati, it was bad. It was bleak. It was disgusting.
Brutal.
0 touchdown passes.
The Bengals did what they do to you.
Correct. They moved along.
You guys know.
They moved along and hired Bill Lazor as their offensive coordinator. I believe it was Ken Zampese who he replaced as the coordinator. And
Correct.
Andy Dalton actually threw 25 touchdown passes over the final 15 weeks of last season. That's the good. The problem was the yards per game were so low. Only one game over his final 11, over 245 passing yards. Really simply, Matthew. Yes, of course you can see anything, but would you bet on Andy Dalton being a sleeper quarterback this year?
No. I think he's a better NFL quarterback than he gets credit for. I think he's sort of maligned for the playoff losses and everything like that. But I think he's a decent NFL quarterback. He's an above-average NFL quarterback and somebody who's had fantasy success.
Yep.
This is a guy that had a top 5 fantasy finish one year. But no, I would not bet on it. I will say it's worth noting he was 5th in touchdown passes from week 3 on, as you noted, when Lazor took over. But yeah, they just don't, and they want to get back to running the ball this year, which brings us, of course,
to Joe Mixon, their second-year running back, who's going on average is running back 15 on ESPN.com right now. Matthew, you have him at 69 and 17, so we're right there in the mix. I said a little while ago that a lot of NFL players experience their greatest leap from year 1 to year 2. I think the question with Joe Mixon is this, and Stephania, I'll ask you, how much of last year's modest season from Joe Mixon was, in our belief, because he's not enough of a talented player, and how much of it was because he was essentially running into a wall every single play because the Bengals offensive line was, objectively speaking, as bad as there was in the NFL last year.
Right. I think that was a big part of the issue. And I think that Joe Mixon, we knew that he was talented. There were some other questions about him coming into the league, but I think that his talent is going to shine ultimately. But the question has been in Cincinnati, who gets the majority of the work? You've still got Giovanni Bernard back there, who ended up, by the way, really picking up for the team.
Right.
I mean, he ended up being the boost in the backfield for them. I don't think you've seen the best of Joe Mixon's play, but there's still the potential for him to struggle if he doesn't have a place to run.
Who is the boost in the backfield for us, Field? I just like that phrase. If Giovanni Bernard was the boost in the backfield for the Bengals, who's the boost in the backfield for the fantasy
I'm trying to think. Do we even have an appropriate? I don't even know if we can even think of an appropriate answer for that.
I think it's Keith Lipscomb.
Works for me. So back to Joe Mixon, Matthew.
Yes.
You've got him ranked inside your top 20.
Yeah.
Do you think that some of that is because once you get past like running back 16, 17, 18, it becomes less clear that players are going to have the dominant workload? Or is it because you believe he's going to have a legit chance to finish as an RB1 this year?
So in my draft A manifesto, which
available
came out
on ESPN.com.
I'm a company man. Nice job.
I'm waiting for the audio version.
Pretty good, Daniel.
We need more drops, by the way. We used to have a ton of drops, and then I feel like you sort of dropped the ball on the drops. Secret squirrel.
I'm going to drop you if you're not careful.
Ooh.
That's the best. You want to try that again?
No, that was it.
I'm going to give you a redo on that insult.
No.
Let's just take a moment here. Can we put up a Twitter poll on how lame that was?
No. We don't need to do that.
So,
are we going to do a audiobook version of the Draft Day Manifesto?
Yeah,
we are.
I'm waiting for it.
Yes, we will. I don't know if I'm going to be the one to read it, but
somebody will read the Draft Day Manifesto.
Will read the Draft Day Manifesto, and that'll come up hopefully in the
Coming to you
next
live
day or
from
two.
Bristol, Connecticut. I'm Randy Scott with the Draft Day Manifesto by Matthew Berry.
Randy Scott would be great.
He is hilarious. So underrated.
I love Randy Scott. All right. So anyway, in the Draft Day Manifesto, I talk about the fact that range of outcomes, and that ideally you want players with a wide, a narrow range of outcomes over the course of the season. Joe Mixon has such a wide range of outcomes. It would not shock me if Joe Mixon ends the year as like a top 3 fantasy running back. That would not shock me. It also would not shock me if Joe Mixon does what he did last year. So the plus side of Mixon very quickly is he's going to get a ton of work behind a revamped offensive line. There was a lot of, to Stephania's point, there wasn't a lot of question about his talent coming out of college. Yep. The questions about him were not about the talent. He seems to be past that. And maybe there's, adjusting the NFL, there was a lot of spotlight on him. And now, a year later, there isn't as much. Having said that, he was really inefficient last year, and maybe some of that's on the blocking, some of that's on the offense, but he just wasn't. And look at this. In the first quarter, 4.6 yards per carry. Second quarter, 3.6 yards per carry. Third quarter, 3 yards per carry. Fourth quarter and overtime, 2.7 yards per carry. He wore down as the game went on over the course of last year. Maybe he's not built. Now, I know he, quote unquote, bulked up. You always hear that in the offseason, but I don't know, Field. Like, I have him in the, I'm hedging my bet on Joe Mixon. I'm completely owning it. He's like a RB2 because he's got that upside, but I don't have tons of confidence.
All about the offensive line. Traded for Cordy Glenn from the Bills.
Right.
Yep.
Drafted Billy Price out of Ohio State.
Yep.
Hurt his pec at the combine, but he's already back on the field. They got to figure out who the right tackle is. They've whiffed on draft picks, but if the offensive line is even average this year, not only would Joe Mixon be an RB2, the Bengals are going to win 8 or more games if that offensive line is good. They've got a lot of talent on that roster. That's never the issue. It's just being consistent.
Yeah, he seriously would not shock me if he's a top 3 fantasy running back
Well,
this
and the
year.
passing game wasn't a threat last year. So
Right.
that hurt them as well.
That hurt in
But
so many ways.
He's got a wide range of outcomes.
And speaking of narrow range of outcomes, by the way, A.J. Green, I mean, not a lot to say there only because he's so darn consistent. His per 16 game averages since 2012, 90 catches, 1,316 yards, 9 touchdowns. I mean, that's tremendous. I mean, he's a legit wide receiver one. The only way that you feel hesitation about A.J. Green is if Andy Dalton gets hurt. But, I mean, if you take him at the back end of round 1, I mean, that might be a little too rich, but he's going to be a top 20 pick this year.
Yes, he is, and he should be. I'm a little bit lower on him than the consensus ranks. I probably won't have him. He's my current wide receiver 10. He's currently going as wide receiver 8. Just a little nervous. Like, he was the 27th. Tristan Cockcroft, our colleague here, does a great job with his consistency rankings. Among wide receivers, A.J. Green was 27th last year. Just very up and down. I know so was the Bengals offense, but that's what you get with Andy Dalton. You're going to get some inconsistency. The guy turns 30 years old tomorrow. He's played all 16 games just twice in the last 4 years. I'm a little nervous about A.J. Green. Again, I have him in my top 10, but you think about his red zone reception percentage last year, right? He scored on 6 of his 7 red zone receptions last year. That's a rate of over 85%. Wide receiver average in 2017, 48%. A.J. Green's career rate entering 2017, 57%. So I think there's some regression coming down in terms of his red zone reception rate as well. We just talked about they want to get back to running the ball. Now, maybe they're a more efficient offense because they're running the ball well, and so maybe touchdowns increase, opportunities increase.
I'm way
wide
less
receiver
concerned than you are about A.J. Green. I mean,
I have him at wide receiver 10,
right.
But I'm just saying there's a reason why I have him lower than the consensus ranks.
We want to wrap up the live portion of the show with some Twitter questions, but before we get to that, and again, tweet us at Fantasy Focus. Before we get to those, though, Stephania, Tyler Eifert, I feel like every single year we're asking questions about him and injuries. He re-signed in Cincinnati, a very incentive-laden deal. He is currently on the PUP list. What can you tell us about his situation?
Look, he says he feels great, but he's coming off his second back surgery in 2 years. I wrote about him. I made in my injury column that's on ESPN.com right now, looking at the player injury situations to watch. I wrote about 7 guys. Tyler Eifert's one of them because he's been injured so much, especially in the last 2 years. He's missed 22 games in the last 2 seasons. Right. And my line in my column, which I believe wholeheartedly, is that 2 things can simultaneously be true. A player who's elite is a game changer, but if you're not available, do you still qualify as elite? And I think Tyler Eifert has had so many serious injuries in his career. I would love nothing more than for him to put together a full season and for us to really get to see, because we know he's such a touchdown maker, a threat in the red zone. But he's just not out there that much.
So you call him a touchdown maker. I call him touchdown dependent, which is why between that and the injury risk, I am shying away from Tyler Eifert going into drafts, save a really deep league where I just let everybody else handle tight ends. Back to your point, Stephania, from 2015 to 2016, 2 seasons worth, 22% of his receptions resulted in a touchdown. That's just really hard to sustain year over year.